So you've finally done it. You've been convinced to go the TP-Link Omada setup, whether that's through your own research or if you've watched my video on the Omada short stack, link up here. Either way, you've got your hardware set up and you're ready to configure everything through the Omada GUI. Luckily, that's what we're going to go over today. How to navigate the GUI from setting it up to going over the dashboard, statistics, and all the basic settings that will get the most out of your Omada configuration. So let's do it. The first thing you have to do is open up a web browser and navigate to the IP address of the Omada controller software, whether that's running on a dedicated Omada controller or virtualized in your home lab. Either way, navigate to the IP address, enter the basic information they're asking for, and eventually you'll be put in a dashboard that looks like this. The first thing you'll actually want to do is go into devices, and obviously this is where all your Omada devices will be listed. Here you can see I have 3 of them that are already connected and adopted into my system. For your use case, you'll probably have all of them listed depending, like this one, if this is the first time you've actually been in here. But I've left this access point to pending just to show you how easy it is to adopt a device. Just click adopt. It's literally that easy. And you can see my setup is relatively simple. I have a firewall, a switch, and 2 access points. You may have less, you may have more, but either way, it's extremely easy to get items adopted and added to your setup. So that is configuring. It'll probably take like a minute or so, but once it's done, you'll be able to configure everything just like you would any other device. So let's start at the top with dashboard and work our way down. As you can see, it's a dashboard. It shows information based on your network, and you can customize it with all these different widgets depending on what type of data you want to show. This is mine. I have ISP load, most active clients, the distribution based on SSID of the clients, PoE utilization, alerts, Wi-Fi traffic distribution, and you can go in and change that to your liking, clicking on this little cog over here and navigating through all the different widgets that are listed here. You know, they might have some other information that you want to see. Just add it and then go ahead, move this down, and you're free to move these about on the screen. So really cool feature for all you stats nerds that just want to see a bunch of charts and graphs. Pretty useful information. Moving down to statistics, you get more charts and graphs. This is broken down a little bit more. So performance, you can click on each individual device and get more granular with the data. We just added this one, so obviously there's not going to be data for that. Obviously you can see more because this is our firewall, and then you can go into switch statistics, which gives you information obviously based on your switches. I only have 1, so it's not that exciting, but for those of you that have large setups, this might be extremely useful to you to see statistics based on individual switches. You can go in here and it's a bit more data broken down by port specifically, and then you can kind of sort it and view it on a time span and blah, blah, blah. The last one being speed test statistics. If you have automatic speed test configured, I'll show you that later. That will show up here if you want to see, you know, what your speed tests has been showing based on your network. You can see that here. Moving on to map, here's where you can view the topology of your network. Very similar if you come from a Unify setup, it's kind of the same deal. Mine's pretty simple, like I said before. We have the internet, or my modem comes into my firewall. From my firewall, we send that to my switch, and then from the switch, we have it going to the controller and 2 access points, and then you can drill down even further from the access point and look at what clients are specifically connected to that. And here you can see we only have 1 because we're just testing it right now, and that is on the 5 gigahertz network. You can also change it to a map view and upload a central blueprint or layout of your building or house, or wherever these are physically located. And then you can actually drag each device and put it in its physical location within that building. It's extremely cool feature to have. I can see it being really useful for businesses, not so much in your home if you don't know where your stuff is in your home. I don't know what to tell you. Devices, we recently were here, but let's dive into more of the options you have from this screen. So obviously you can find your devices here. And from here, you can click on each one of them and kind of go into more statistics, details and configurations about each device. And each device will have slightly different configurations because you'll have different configurations for an access point than you would a router, than you would a switch. So going through here, you'll see details about the device, what networks it's on, obviously for the firewall, and then some configurations. You can go through here. One common one is LED. So if you don't like having all the blinky lights while you're trying to sleep at night, you can just turn them off. Really underrated feature. And then scrolling through here, you can see different configurations. It's more useful on access points. So let's go over there to one of our access points and you'll see details. We have a bit more information. You can see where the uplink is to, what radios are being broadcasted, some information about those. Going over to config, this is where you can specify a name for the device. Again, LEDs if you want them off. Device tags, this can be for other settings. They might use tags, so you can tag certain devices with different tags. If you want to get really granular with some settings, you can do that. IP settings, DHCP or static. Failback IP, it's a cool feature in the Omada line. If something happens where you're no longer getting an IP address from your DHCP server, it has a static fallback IP that it'll rely on, so you'll know how to get into it if for some reason it gets disconnected. Radios, 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, you can specify the channel with, what channel it's specifically on, and the transmission power. WLANs, I'll get more into this later, but this is where you can specify a WLAN group. They're all by default, obviously, but you can see we have this guest one here. I'll touch on that in a bit. It's essentially being able to define what wireless networks you want this access point to use, but we'll see in a minute. Some advanced settings in here that you can go through. I'm not going to touch every single setting on every single feature of Omada. That would be a really long video and get into the weeds that a lot of you don't care about. So we're going to skip some things in this video. I apologize, but I don't. And manage device, you can move this to a new site, forget this access point and completely remove it from Omada, and do a custom firmware update if you need that. But you'll be notified if there is an update to a device. You'll see it over here. It'll give you a little warning and it'll let you just automatically update it by clicking a button over here. So we're good. All of our devices are up to date. Let's move on to clients. Can you guess what is listed here? Clients. So here we have our one device. Just like in devices, you can click on it and see information about it. What specifically, if it's connected to an access point wirelessly, which one it's connected to, history about it if you have that enabled, and again, configurations, which is where you can specify custom rate limits, which is really cool. You can see ones we have listed here, the default and limited. I'll get to that when we get to settings. Or you can specify a new rate limit, which essentially lets you just limit the amount of bandwidth this specific device has, which is a very cool feature to have and very useful. If you don't want a specific device sucking up a lot of bandwidth, you can limit it here. Insight, a really cool, nerdy section of the Omada GUI where you can find a whole bunch of information about your network, known clients, so clients that have appeared on your network, past connections of those clients, portal authorizations, we'll touch on that later. Switch status, we only have one, so not that cool. Port forwarding, if you're doing any port forwarding, VPN status, routing table, dynamic DNS, rogue APs. It seems like a hodgepodge of random things to put here. Not that it's a bad thing. I like having that information, but it's just kind of random. So I don't know if stuff is useful for you that I've shown here, that's where you find it. And log, obviously, logs. Any alerts that come up will be shown here. You can narrow it down, obviously. Moving to events, you'll see just events that pop up on the system. You can scroll through here and kind of see what's been going on. And notifications, this is where you can get very granular in how you want to be alerted based on different events that happen on the system. You can go through here and decide if that's an event, alert, or a specific email. You can set up emails through your controller. I'll touch on that a bit later too, but obviously all logging and notification stuff is done in this section. So let's get into the important part, settings. There's gonna be a lot here, so buckle up. I'm going to try not to spend too much time on one thing, but there are a lot of settings and configurations that can be done in Omada. Obviously, I can't cover it all, but I'm going to cover what I think is important. Starting with site, most people are just going to have one. If you're a large business and have multiple sites, you can pick which one you want to manage up here and change the configurations of that site down in the settings. But it's pretty basic information, the name of it, time zone, some settings for the services. A lot of this is left default. There are two things that I changed from their default configuration. One being the periodic speed test that is off by default. I enabled it and set it to run once every 24 hours. That's just going to run a speed test, obviously every 24 hours. And store that information so that the chart I showed before, we can have a bunch of information. If you don't want it, if you don't care about that, it's off by default, you can certainly leave it. Another thing down in advanced features that I've turned on that was off by default is band steering. This is a setting that essentially says for your access points in the Omada network, if a device connects to it that is both 2.4 and 5 gigahertz compatible, automatically move that to the faster 5 gigahertz network. This is my home network. I'd like all my devices to connect to 5 gigahertz automatically, so this is on. Moving on into wired networks, you can see the submenu shows internet and LAN. Not a big deal. I wish it said WAN and LAN because, when you click on internet, it's all WAN settings. So I don't know why they didn't just call us WAN. So we only have one WAN coming in. If you have multiple WANs, you can select which physical ports on your firewall you want that WAN to be configured on. I only have one, so it's not a big thing or anything I can really change. If you want to see me go into a dual WAN setup to do, failover stuff in Omada, let me know down in the comments. If that's something you guys want to see, I'll certainly do a video on that. But we only have one LAN. There's not much here. For IPv4, you're probably just going to leave this to dynamic to get an IP address from your ISP. Or if you need a static one, you can specify all that information here. If you want to use IPv6, it's disabled by default. You can turn it on if you have IPv6 connectivity. The last setting in here is for specifying your MAC address. Now, by default, you probably don't care and just let it use its own MAC address. But if you need to spoof a MAC address because your ISP gave you a router that has a specific MAC address and they're blocking any other routers you try to connect, which is what some what some ISPs do, you could copy that MAC address from the router they gave you, go in here and enter it as a custom MAC address and essentially spoof that so that your modem thinks that it's talking to the router provided by your ISP. You can do that here. Moving on to LAN, this is going to be where you set up multiple interfaces. So you can see we have a few here. By default, you'll have this initial LAN interface. And then you can see I've added two. I've added an IoT one and a guest network one. Let's go in the guest network one and I'll show you basically why I have it set up in this way and what the settings are for configuring a new interface. The first thing you'll kind of see here is that the purpose will ask you to select if it's an interface or a VLAN. So if you're creating a new VLAN, your instincts would probably say, well, yeah, let's do a VLAN. But in the Omada network, 99% of the time, you're going to leave it as an interface because this is going to be what's going to allow you to essentially create a new VLAN and use that as an interface. What this VLAN option really does is essentially creates like a virtual VLAN type that will let you assign that VLAN tag to different devices if you're just using that downstream from another system that's assigning tagged packets. So for the most part, if you want to create a new VLAN using the Omada network, just keep it at interface and specify the VLAN tag here. Then you can specify which physical ports this will be on, enter the gateway that you want to use for DHCP on that interface. I like to go with this configuration or this kind of syntax. The tag would be 99, so we'll do 192.168.99.1 on a 24 subnet. If you want more, do 23. If you want even more, do 22. But for the most part, 24 is good. Click Update DHCP range, and it'll automatically update your range down here. You see I've left some IPs outside of the range. That's because I like having at least like 10 to 20 IP addresses outside of the range that I can use for static IPs and not have to worry about the DHCP server trying to assign those to another device. So, I changed that to 20. We have enough here for a basic home network. Nothing to worry about. A cool feature within Omada is being able to assign specific DNS servers per interface. So within this VLAN interface, we can just say, use the automatic DNS server that's given to us, or we can manually specify our own DNS server, and you can do that per interface, which is a really cool feature. Lease time, default gateway, Omada controller, just leave all that. All right, wireless networks, something that everyone cares about because everyone uses Wi-Fi. So let's jump into it. Initially, you'll have a default SSID set up here. I changed it to Omada, very creative, I know. And you can also add SSIDs here. So SSIDs or wireless networks, whatever you want to call it. You can see we've created one called Omada Guest. So let's click on that and see what goes into creating a new wireless network. So obviously you'll specify a name for it. You can tell it to use the 2.4 or 5 or both. Guest network. You're probably confused because this is my Omada Guest, but I don't have guest network checked. That's because I'm doing it manually. So you can select this, and what that's going to do is create a guest network that is essentially its own hidden VLAN that separates this network from all the other networks. And that's totally fine. That's what most people probably should do, but I'm weird and I like doing it manually. So in security, that's going to be where you specify your Wi-Fi password. You're probably looking at this and saying, none, what are you, crazy? Anybody can just get into your network. More on that in a bit. And then in advanced settings, this is going to be where you can specify the VLANs you created before. And I wish there was a way for you to specify that based on a drop down. So I have two VLANs set up, a guest one on 99 and an IoT one on 50. I wish there was a way to enable VLANs here and be able to select that from a drop down, because as of right now, you just have to know which tag you want to use. So, if this is a guest one, I have to remember that I'm using tag 99. So I enter it here. It'd be a lot more convenient if I could just select my guest network here, but that's just how it'd be. And rate limit, more on that in a bit, but you can see mine is specified as limited. It's basically a way to limit how much bandwidth is going through the entire network at one time. We'll touch on that more in a bit, don't worry. And then you can do schedules on this. I don't have that done, but if you want this wireless network to act on a schedule and only be active during certain times, you can enable that and specify it here. All right, WLAN groups. I said we'd talk about it, so let's talk about it. You can see by default, we are on the default one, which contains all of our networks that we've created, but I've created another one called Guest, which only contains the guest network SSID. This is a similar feature to if you're coming from the Unify setup, where you can create a group of access points and assign those to a specific SSID. It's kind of the reverse in Omada. You essentially create a group of SSIDs and assign that to an access point. So it's backwards. I don't think one's necessarily better than the other. They're just different. So you'll see if I go back to devices, I can go to this access point. Let's click on it. I can go over into config, and down here under WLANs, you'll see obviously it's initially set to default, which means it's broadcasting all SSIDs. I can change that to guest, and now this access point is only broadcasting for the Omada Guest network. Okay, moving on to network security. I have pretty mixed feelings about the way they've set this up in Omada. So to do basic firewall settings, that's going to be in this ACL tab, and they've broken it down by gateway, switch, and access points. And I don't necessarily like that. I like firewall rules just being broken down by interface rather than by physical hardware. This just makes it confusing and harder to understand what's actually being blocked and let through. So let's kind of talk about this, and let's move this out of the way. Side note, if you have any questions about the page you're on and what it does, click on this question mark over here. They actually do a good job of explaining what you're seeing on the page and how to configure it and what it actually does. So if you get stuck and you don't understand what's going on the page, yeah, just click that question mark in the top right corner. But yeah, essentially the gateway is for LAN going to WAN connections. Switch is going to be where you want to specify your actual network to network firewall rules. And at the access point level, I've messed with it. It doesn't seem to work very well. I mean, I'm sure it does something, but this is going to be your bread and butter here in the switch ACL. So let's take a look at one of the rules I have set up, and just note by default, there's going to be nothing in here. And by default, Omada has everything open. So when you create a VLAN, note that it will be able to access other interfaces within your network by default. You're going to have to customize a rule in here to deny that from other networks. So you can see we created an IoT VLAN. So let's go in and look at our IoT rule. So I call this one IoT to LAN. It's enabled, it's a deny policy on all protocols. And I've essentially said anything going from the IoT network to the LAN, deny it. Meaning that nothing on the IoT network can reach anything on my main LAN. Once that's implemented, guests or any IoT devices that are sitting on that network, if they're compromised somehow, at least they won't be able to access devices on my main network. So that's how you go about setting up something like this. And there's a lot more that goes into this, but again, I don't want this video to be extremely long. Anything I've covered in here, if you want to see more about it, just let me know down in the comments and I'll consider doing a full video on that and going deeper into some of these topics. But moving on, we have URL filtering, which essentially lets you block specific URLs. So you can see I have a test one here. It's not enabled, but it's for TacoBell.com. So let's show you how this works. If I go to TacoBell.com, boom, what is this? That looks delicious, actually. 3 bubbling cheeses, 2, yo, this actually looks good. But if I go into this rule that I specified, this is a deny rule on these networks for these URLs, anything related to TacoBell.com. Let's enable it, apply. And now if I try to access TacoBell.com, why does it still work? I'm not on IoT, I don't think. Transmission, this is going to be where you do your NAT and routing stuff. So routing, you can do your static routing and your policy-based routing here, which for the most part is only really useful if you have multiple WANs and you want specific devices to route through a specific WAN. We only have one, so there's not really much policy routing to do here. You can set up specific static routes. It's pretty straightforward. NATing is essentially your port forwarding. So everybody knows what port forwarding is for the most part. Go in here, give it a name, what interface you're on, if you have multiple WANs. If you want to just throw it in the DMZ and open up everything, you can create that rule here. Or if you want to just specify ports, you can do that here. If you want to do a range, you get the picture, destination IP, destination port, TCP or UDP, and create. VPN, another mixed feeling. On one hand, it's really awesome, and one hand, not so much. Let's talk about why. So you can see I have 2 listed here. One is a server and one is a client. Let's talk about the server first. So if you want to be able to VPN back into your home network that's running the Omada software, you can very easily set it up to do that. So you'd go in here, give it a name, specify it as a client to site VPN, and the VPN type, VPN server, and the protocol you want to use. I use OpenVPN. What local networks you want to be able to access, which WAN you want to use, and an IP pool. So this is where you can specify a brand new pool you want your VPN to use. I've created one here. Click apply, and just like that, you are running a VPN server on your Omada setup. And if you want to use that, it gives you this export icon over here. Just click that. It builds you a little OpenVPN profile. And if you just open this on whatever client device you want to use that has the OpenVPN client software, doesn't matter where you are in the world, you can run this and you'll be VPN directly back into your home network. Pretty cool feature. I really like how easy it is to set up a VPN server on here. So what don't I like? Well, VPN client. So very similarly, we'll go in here, give it a name, client to site, but this time we're doing a VPN client. And you're probably thinking, well, what does that mean? Well, in theory, that would allow the Omada system to act as a client and connect to another VPN. I personally use PIA as a VPN provider, and I've entered that here. I've given the name as PIA. I've specified the exact remote server to use within PIA. I've specified the WAN, and I've even imported the configuration file to connect to. And yeah, it's easy to set up, but you can't really do anything with it. So if you're coming from something like pfSense where you can set up a VPN client and essentially use that as a separate WAN interface, you can't do that here. Or at least I haven't found a way to do it, and I haven't seen anybody do it. So I'm really hoping that this comes in a future upgrade to the Omada software where I could create a VPN client connection and essentially use that as a WAN interface where I can go back to my policy routing, and instead of just having one WAN interface here, I can have my VPN client and route devices directly through that VPN rather than my WAN. But as of now, I don't believe there's any way to do it. So maybe you're watching this in the future and you can, who knows? Moving on, let's talk about profiles. Not much to this, it's just setting up profiles for different things like time range. If you want to, there's certain things you can do based on a time range, like Wi-Fi scheduling that we saw before. You can specify a custom time range here to use in other settings. I don't have any of these set up. It's pretty basic if you want to do that though. Groups is essentially groups of devices. And you can do that. You can go in here and create a new group, and you can do that by IP and port, or by MAC address. And it's a useful feature to have, but I just don't like how they've implemented specifying an IP group, because in pfSense, you can just specify individual devices. You can say, I know I have, this range of IPs, or I know I have these specific 5 IP addresses that I want to assign to a group. You can't really do that easily in here. It's not too difficult, but it's not intuitive. So for example, if I wanted to use 192.168.50.6, you're essentially, if you only want to do that one, you would use subnet 32 since it's only one IP. If you wanted to use, 6 through the next, I can't remember the exact number, but 24 is 255 devices. If you wanted to do the next 255 in that subnet, that's how you would do it, which is really unintuitive. I'd like to just be able to specify an exact range instead of having to use subnets like this. It's kind of confusing, but if you wanted to do individual ones, you just have to create multiple entries in here with the 32 subnet. Again, you can do it, it's just not very intuitive. Rate limits, we briefly touched on that earlier. Remember, I had my guest network set to limited. Essentially, this is where you can create your own bandwidth profile. And you can see limited, I have it limited to 50 megabits up and 50 megabits down, meaning that whoever connects to my guest network can't hog all the bandwidth. They only get 50 megabits up and down. And you can do or utilize this however you want, but that's how I'm using it. Authentication, I'm not going to go too much into this. The one cool thing that's in here is Portal. And this is essentially more for businesses. If you go to a restaurant and they have their open Wi-Fi network and you connect to it, and it gives you like a page that says, use our password or whatever, connect here, and you log in, and then it, lets you online. That's what this is. So we can take a look at this one I've set up, and this is why before I had a guest network with no password. That's because it's using a captive portal. I've given it a name, turned it on. I've specified it to this network. In here, you can drill down to specific SSIDs or use entire networks. Here I'm using the entire guest network. You can specify an authentication type. For most people, you'll probably just use a simple password, specify that here, give them a time limit or a authentication timeout on here. Mine's 8 hours. Redirection, HTTPS redirection, you can do that. You can have a landing page be the original URL or send them somewhere else. You know how in a hotel, when you do it, you connect and then it brings you to like an advertisement page. You can specify that here. And here's where you can specify settings for the actual page, which is really cool. There's a lot of stuff in here. You can have a custom page, or you can use their template, upload a picture, use a solid color, upload your own logo, position the logo, change the color, the font, the buttons, terms of service, a whole bunch of stuff in here that's targeted to businesses. So if you're a home user, you probably don't care about this, but for businesses, this is awesome. All the stuff I'm not going to talk about because I either don't know what it is or it's not a big deal for most people. Services. This is kind of a hodgepodge of different things. The only one in here that's kind of useful for the most part is dynamic DNS. This is going to be where you can have your Omada controller update your IP that you have at your house to remote servers that are running services based on your IP. So a common one is no IP. They only have 4 in here. I wish they'd add more, specifically Cloudflare, which is because that's what I use as my DNS provider personally. No IP is a big one. I actually use that too for my game servers. But essentially what that does is I can specify no IP. I can go in here and enter my username and password for no IP, the domain name I'm using, and how often I want it to update my IP to that remote server, so that in the event that my home IP address changes, that will be updated so I don't really lose connectivity on those remote services. Another one's UPnP. This is off by default. I recommend leaving it off. UPnP essentially allows certain devices to automatically open ports. I don't like having that on, but you do you. If you want it on, this is where you turn it on. SSH, if you want to be able to SSH into your controller, bada bing, bada boom. Export data for analytics for all you nerds, you can do that here. Controller, this is pretty basic stuff for your Omada controller. If you have different ones for different sites, you can access their settings here. Not too much, honestly. Give it a name. Time zone, if you want to specify custom NTP server. Again, failback IP address, useful to have. You can set up a mail server if you want the controller to send email notifications, do it here. How long to keep the history, if you want to use a custom certificate for accessing the GUI, and the ports you want to use for accessing all can be managed here. Cloud access, it's exactly what it sounds like, being able to access your entire Omada network from anywhere using their cloud access. Yeah, I mean, useful feature to have. If you don't want it, you can easily turn it off. Maintenance, it's maintenance stuff. Not much here that I want to cover. Backup and restore, obviously you're going to want to create backups of your setup in the event that something happens. You'll be able to restore it from that backup file. Rebooting the controller itself, it can be done through here. And why auto backup is in its own menu down here is very strange. It should just be in here, I think, but it's not. So if you want to do auto backups, go down to here, turn that on. You will need a USB drive plugged into the controller so that it has somewhere to store the automatic backups, but that's where you can do that. And migration is if you want to migrate your setup to a completely other site, you can do that. That's for larger businesses with multiple sites. For the home user, you won't use this. So I think that is it. I pretty much covered everything I've wanted to for, just getting this set up and covering the basics. I know I didn't touch on everything. I didn't go into super detail on everything. Like I said, if there's something I missed or something that you want to see me cover more, let me know down in the comments. And if enough people want to see it, I'll definitely make a dedicated video on that in the future. But that's it. I hope it was informative. I hope you got some use out of this. If you like this video, then drop a like below. If you like content like this, then please consider subscribing. It helps the channel out a ton. And I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube members and my Patreons. You guys are my Omada setup with cloud access and proper firewall configuration. It's just, wow. Yeah, if you're still here watching the video, I sincerely appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.